Hello, I'm Dr. Basil Considine, and I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be talking about psychosocial vectors and how to cite your different sources. This is part of a series of webinars that we have at the Writing Center. We offer new webinars every term, and we include an extensive archive of all the webinars we've offered on the ACU Online Writing Center website. Here's a brief sample of some of the things to come. We have, for example, Avoiding Plagiarism with APA 7 coming up on Tuesday, September 7th. We have our Analysis and Synthesis webinar on Tuesday, the 21st. And for each of these webinars, if you do not see that you can attend the webinar in real time, you can always RSVP for it, and then we will add you to the list of recipients. So you'll get a link to the recording and a copy of the slide deck as those come available, even if you can't make it in person. With that, let us continue on and dive into our main focus today, which is to say we are going to be looking at a couple things that come up in HIED 622's Week 2, Assignment 2, Self-Reflection with Development Vectors. We're going to specifically look at primary and secondary citations, understanding what they are and when you might use them, and then we'll look at some particulars of the assignment, and then finish with the section where you're be invited to continue and draft your paper. All right, so primary and secondary citations in APA style. What are these? Well, first of all, a primary citation is a reference in the body of your paper to a source that you consulted. A secondary citation is when you are identifying a source that the author of what you actually read cited. So if I read Smith 2010 and Smith 2010 read Johnson 2005, and I wanted to point out that this idea came from Johnson, then I would be doing a secondary citation. It's not that it would be incorrect for me to cite Smith 2010, but there are, when you're trying to make clear who came up with what idea and show how people modified it, you often want to identify this. Now, if I'd just gone and read Johnson 2005 myself, I could cite it directly, no need to go through the other source. But the more detailed and specific research you do, the more likely you're going to be working with secondary sources. Now, one place where this matters is that anything that is a primary citation, which is, say, a work that you consulted yourself and that you cite in the body of your paper, goes in your references list in APA style. A secondary citation, on the other hand, does not, because you didn't read it yourself, and so you're not putting it in the reference list. This is different from humanities writing, which often has extensive lists of things that, well, you didn't quite read, but you refer to it in some way. Scientific writing, we want to be clear about the boundaries of what you have and haven't done. And one of the places that this comes up is with identifying that, oh, this is a secondary citation. I did not read this source directly. So a primary citation would be your classic author date, Smith 2019. And then with a secondary citation, something about the sentence arrangement or the wording inside the citation tells us that it's, for example, Smith 2019 as cited by Nakamura 2021. So that's saying the info comes originally from Smith 2019. Nakamura 2021 cited this as coming from Smith 2019, but I didn't read that. I only read Nakamura 2021. So primary citations are the default, and strictly speaking, it's the only level that you're required to do. You don't have to go to the additional level to cite your secondary citations, to give your secondary citations. But when you're discussing the evolution of ideas and where they came from, it's very helpful to do that and to point out that this is something that came at a specific time, because that helps give you, among other things, a clearer chronology. Where did this begin? How did it evolve? Which came first? Now, secondary citations are also very helpful if you are going to be identifying a quote that you found in the primary source, the primary citations source, but that was them quoting another author. So the secondary citation, in that case, clarifies who actually wrote it in a way that is much more clear than some other ways that you might convey that same information. So, for example, if you're describing a theory, you might have something like, oh, Stanley's 1968 theory of disgruntlement states, blah. Now, it's not that you have to include that date there, but if you don't, then your reader has no idea how old this theory is. And so if you're making a case that it is a theory that's been used for a while, then having that date showing, oh, this is from 1968 might be helpful evidence in your argument. So in this example we have here, again, Johnson 2019, that's the primary citation. Stanley 1968 is a secondary citation. And that relationship exists regardless of where these are. If you just said the theory of disgruntlement states, and then had Stanley, 1968, as cited by Johnson 2019, well, Stanley 1968 would still be the secondary source, even though it's grouped in the parenthetical citation set at the end of the sentence. All right, let's look at this next example. The theory of reasoned action stated that. Now, you might have a couple questions about the tense. We'll come back to that. The theory of reasoned action, Fishbein and Ashgen 1967, stated that individuals behave according to their pre-existing attitudes and intentions, Johnson 2019. Now, one of the places this comes up is that often ideas evolve. So there is a new version of the ideas in this particular theory that replaced the theory of reasoned action, where they came up with a more advanced thing and then gave it a different name. And especially when an author says, okay, well, this is the latest, greatest, better thing. In that case, you might be referring it to in past tense because they have replaced it. They've stated, okay, that was the thing. Here's what it is now. And that's very common. A lot of theories and models are refined and revised. And again, this is one of those reasons why you want to include the date for these secondary citations, because that tells us where that was, the specific version that was being referred to. Because even theory of reasoned action, Fishbein and Ashgen came up with a couple different articles on that before they came up with the version where they changed the name. So this tells us, oh, that version of that idea. So something that comes up a lot as you start writing more about yourself and decisions that you take, especially decisions about research that you might design, is to have a reference to a source where you're not saying that they said this, but you're saying, oh, I'm aligning what I'm doing, or I'm following a recommendation from this author. And with that, you might get phrasing like, I will recruit 20 to 30 research participants as recommended by Smith 2010. Now, this is different meaning than if you just had, I will recruit 20, 30 research participants, parentheses, Smith, 2010, because that would be saying that Smith 2010 was the source of the information. And, they're probably not writing about what you'll be doing 11 years later. That would not make sense. So in this case, this phrasing says, okay, you are following the guidelines of Smith 2010, but the first part of the sentence, the I will recruit this, that's just you're stating something you are doing, your knowledge, your plan. Now, there are other levels of detail you can include. So that same first half of the sentence, I will recruit 20 to 30 research participants in alignment with Smith's 2010 guidelines for minimum sample size. So that not only tells us, oh, Smith said that this was fine, or this was something to do, but specifically Smith gave guidelines for minimum sample, and that's why I have 20 to 30. And you might also use phrasing like this: IRB approval will be obtained prior to any data collection, as suggested by Mendez 2021. Now, it would also be correct to have this sentence read, IRB approval will be obtained prior to any data collection, as suggested by Mendez, parentheses 2021. But really, it's a kind of an incidental note saying you're aligning with it. And so putting all of that in parentheses just helps the reader parse the flow of the paragraph better. And just a reminder, when you are doing this sort of, you're aligning your actions with a particular source, these cited sources should all be listed in the references list. All right, let's take a look at week 2, assignment 2 in HIED 622. So this is the self-reflection with development vectors assignment. And this particular assignment asks you to explore Weiser's work on psychosocial development identities, psychosocial development, in which Weiser identified 7 vectors on different things that college students encounter. So ultimately, you're going to be applying one of these vectors to your own development, and they give you this list of the 7 vectors to use. Great. And I think before we begin, and keep in mind that you're ultimately going to be writing a paper that is of 3 to 5 pages in length for the body, not the title page, not the references. The body is going to be 3 to 5, and that's a fair amount to be writing about your own stuff. So before you go too far, I think it's a good idea to pick which one you're going to be writing about with an eye towards what is something that you care about and therefore are more likely to have more to say about. Now, for example, here, I might look at this and say, well, establishing identity, there's a lot, but also a ton of reading. That might take more than 3 to 5 pages for me to feel that I've done a great job. On the other hand, I might look at, say, developing integrity and say, oh, that is reasonably concise, but I feel I've got a lot to say. I can do that in 3 to 5 pages. Whatever is applicable to you, before you start writing, just ask yourself, do you have a fair amount to say? And is it a ton to say, or just a more modest thing that you can think and do in 3 to 5 pages? All right, so you're writing your paper with the standard voicing for writing a graduate level paper in APA style, which is you are writing to a kind of generic reader who is reasonably intelligent, but not familiar with your specific topic. So you need to explain these ideas by introducing them. So don't assume that they know what these vectors are. You need to describe them, cite them, etc. Now, the guidelines say you may describe your college years or how the vector describes your development over a longer period of time. Okay, sure. You can certainly bring your own experience, it's telling you. Some may apply the vector from the college years to the present day experience. So if you want to relate it to your professional practice, what you're doing right now or what brought you to this program, absolutely okay. But whatever you choose, and those aren't the only options, you're going to want to spend at least a few sentences describing the vector that you've chosen, and then systematically connect your own experience with the domain of development in this vector. And along the way, explain how you've developed in this vector and how does that relate to what Weiser described? Because you could go about it and say, well, Weiser says these things happen in this order, did not happen for me. Or it could be, yes, it did happen more or less as they said, and here's what I would do next time around, or advising students because of that, whatever the case may be. And then again, this is going to be 3 to 5 pages in length. It's going to be an APA style. There's that note to cite and provide references for the readings and any additional sources you might introduce. So you will probably have, although the course text is great, you will probably find that you can delve into some of these topics a little bit better if you do a little bit of additional research. We'll talk about that in a moment. And of course, you want to include a reference page that has AP formatted references for all the works that you are citing that require citations, meaning the primary citations. All right, and if you look at the rubric, it's saying, hey, do all these things. We have a nice list of things that you should be discussing in those sentences about the chosen vector. So when it says explain the vector, we have actually a list of appropriate use, correct implementation, the theory, the concepts or strategies. So a list of things to go through. And then much of it is, okay, have you clearly written all the things that the assignment requires, and does it read well, does it format in APA style, etc. All right, so let's talk about some related things. And I encourage you to download a copy of the APA course paper template because it'll make a lot of the formatting faster and easier. But make sure that you answer each promptly directly in brief and then respond in detail. So that could be as simple as, I have chosen such and such a vector. And then you have your explanation of why you chose it and what the vector is. But starting with that, oh, this is the vector that I chose. All right. When you're writing about your own experience, make sure to use I statements. Don't use the writer or the researcher. There are some styles of writing that do use that. APA style got rid of that about 13 years ago when they started APA 6 and we're now on APA 7 because they realized it would get very confusing to talk about people as if they were you when they're not. As part of that, make sure that you use the language of the prompts. Let's explore that one a little bit and duck back to look at what the prompt says. So when it says, systematically connect your own experience with the domain of development, you can use the language of the prompt. Say, oh, there are several areas where my own experience connects with such and such a vector. Let's say with how I developed my sense of integrity. And then now that you've told the reader that's what you're telling them, give us a couple follow-up sentences about how that is the case. All right, and when you say when you're responding to the prompt, how have you developed in this vector, use that phrasing. And you specifically use the word developing. And it's not that the reader won't quite get the idea if you use the word growing or something like that, but it's more clear that you're responding to that exact thing when you use the specific word choices. And that's where that explicitly addressed thing comes in. Does your reader know that absolutely you're talking about the same thing? Well, if you use the wording there, that will be much more clear. All right, continuing on here. Consistent word choices to refer to the same thing. So this is an area where if you have studied in another field or in high school, for example, you may have been strongly encouraged to use synonyms now to call out that thesaurus and use a variety of wording. And again, there are some styles of writing where that's exactly what you would do. A lot of humanities writing does that because they're trying to get around more complex things by describing things that are close to it. Scientific writing is different. You want to use exactly the thing that is specified. And as an example, if you are cooking, there is the nightshade family. And, tomatoes are part of the nightshade family. They are not poisonous. But if you were to use your standard nightshade, well, that is poisonous and you do not want that in your salad. So that's an example where you want to be very specific and indicate tomatoes, not something else, and that you refer to it consistently. If you start saying tomato and then pomodoro, well, if you speak Italian, a tomato is a pomodoro, but not everyone will get that. And if you just use tomato both times, then it'll be more clear. Incidentally, if you know a little bit of Romance language, pomodoro literally means golden apple. So the original tomatoes that came to Italy were what we now call yellow tomatoes. So if you really want to be specific in Italian and you're referring to, you send someone shopping, and if you want to get, like, say, a red Roma tomato, you should say, oh, pomodoro de Roma rosso. And if you break it down, it sounds a little bit weird to an American because it's, okay, golden apple, Roma, red. But it is specific, and you will get the type of tomato you ask for. Here in the United States, you just say, oh, Roma tomato, and that's that specific type. Okay. Now, you also want to use the rubric and the instructions to come up with approximate lengths here. So what do we have to do here? Well, in this case, the instructors do actually state that the vector definition, the explanation of what this is, why it's important, should be around 50 to 75 words. And if we understand that a double-spaced page with 1-inch margins, 12-point font, basically what you get if you use our APA template, is going to be around 250 pages, we're talking somewhere around 4 to 5 sentences of writing about the vector. So if you start your paragraph with a short sentence and say, I've chosen this vector to write about, and then you use the rest of the paragraph to explain what it is, it's going to be a decent sized paragraph. Somewhere roughly 75 to 100 words total. And so that's going to be that first part. You'll of course want to outline what you're writing about in the paper. So that'll be a couple more sentences. And the rest of that 3 to 5 pages will be you're talking about your own experience, how you developed, how it did or didn't align with the literature, and so on and so forth. Okay. So before you begin writing, you know that you're going to be referring to the course textbook. So it's always a good idea to make sure you've got that in your references list. But also be aware that if we just look at the syllabus, it's actually cut off part of the author list here. So see that Q, we're missing the name that goes with that because this book has 4 authors. And I've given you an example of what that should look like here when it's in your reference list and how to cite it. So basically we take out the place that it was published, the city and the state info. We take out the ISBN. We need to convert the title, that's Student Development in College Theory, Research and Practice. We need to convert that into sentence case. And then the 3rd edition, that information gets abbreviated and placed in parentheses as you see here. So a citation in APA 7th edition is going to be a little bit more concise than what you see here in the syllabus. That's fine, the syllabus gives you enough information to order it. But when it comes to citing it in your paper, make sure you use the correct form, which we've presented here for your benefit. So when you are referring to things that you've read in this textbook, in general, you're probably going to be doing a lot of identifying specific authors, like Chickering 1969 described development as encompassing 7 vectors, parentheses, Patton et al. 2016. So this is saying, oh, Chickering did this. They published it in 1969. I know about it because I read Patton et al. 2016. Now, if you're doing a quote from this source, you'd have a secondary quotation, which would look something like this. Bronfenbrenner, 1993, described microsystems as including, quote, activities, roles, and interpersonal relations experienced by the developing persons, close quote, parentheses, as quoted in Patton et al. 2016, page 43. Now, this isn't including the page number for the original source for Bronfenbrenner, and that's generally not required or expected, and it takes up space, which can distract from the rest of the ideas. This is saying Bronfenbrenner wrote these things, but you didn't look at the original. You're taking Patton et al.'s word for this is how it's worded. And again, you encountered this idea and this specific text through Patton et al. Now, if you're just going to be relaying the idea, you're probably not going to be using a secondary citation, and then you just have primary citations like, oh, privilege is an important factor in the student experience at US colleges, Patton et al. 2016. But if you're discussing the evolution of ideas or how specific authors talk about it, you might have phrasing like, oh, Evans stated that the privilege is an important factor in the student experience at US colleges. And this is a way of identifying, well, this isn't necessarily the only idea, but you're specifically saying this is what Evan said was going on with privilege. Now, that's not incorrect. It's a question of what are you trying to convey and what's your argument? Because if you had Evans 2008 stated, now we have a sense of chronology. And so if you're talking about recent ideas, say your paragraph is about ideas for these vectors in the 21st century, and having Evans 2008 is helpful because that tells us, oh, that's only 13 years old. Or conversely, that's 13 years old if you're trying to make the case that things have been changing very recently and that things aren't always as they used to be. So what you don't want to do is have something like this example at the bottom. Evans stated that privilege is an important factor in the student experience at U.S. colleges, parentheses, Evans, 2008, as cited by Patton et al. 2016. It is not that this is incorrect here, but this is a more verbose, less concise way of giving the same information as the previous example. We have extra material in here. The as cited by, the repetition of Evans. So basically that's 4 words worth that we just don't need because it's not changing the essentials, it's not changing the details, it's just saying the same thing, taking up more space. And APA style emphasizes conciseness to clarify how ideas are connected and what you're supposed to be paying attention to. Before we leave off, there's one more thing that I wanted to do. So we frequently get questions from students doing this assignment asking, well, how do I go and find some more information on this? How do I find an additional source for me to cite here? And so what I've done here is I've gone to the ACU library page, acu.edu/library. And let's go ahead and take a look at what comes up if we just search for psychosocial vectors. Now, the reason I'm putting this in quotation marks is because I want it to be searching for the specific 2-word term, not psychosocial separate from vectors. I want that combined thing. Now, if I go ahead and do this, it'll check to make sure that I have access to the ACU library and everything. And then it will spit out some results. And let's see what's going on. And you can see that for psychosocial vectors specifically, we have just 15 sources, which is not terribly many, but also for what we're doing, it's just a 3 to 5 page paper. That's not necessarily a problem. Now, if you're looking for more, go ahead and you can see that there's this chat with us button here where you could do a live text chat or ask a librarian. We could send an email about it. If you're trying to find something and you can't find it, then you can always use that to contact our library staff who will be happy to assist you. But looking at this, let us say that we said, well, we want to specifically be looking at college. So I'm going to add college here. And you see we now have 9 results. So this is getting more specific. All right, so what might we do here? Well, let's say that you are checking out these different sources and it's like, okay, well, 21-year-old worker is not really what I'm interested in here. And say, well, okay, hey, hold on. What if this one here, theory to practice in academic libraries, cognitive development, that sounds like what I want. So if we go ahead and open it up using this, we can see, do we have the ability to read this article right now? And we want to check that before you get too involved. Do we have the capacity to read this specific article right now? Yes, we can. Great. Now, whether you're on this catalog page or whether you're on this result page, look for a cite button. because that will give you, some text to start with for putting in your reference list. And you'll see that this one here, let's go ahead and set this to APA 7th edition here. See what we get. This is pretty good. This is almost exactly right. The difference is here is that the DOI thing here, this isn't quite the correct format. This will work for you because you can log into the ACU system. It will not work for someone else. So you want to use the https://doi.org/ and then this format. And then the other thing here is that this comma is not supposed to be italicized, and it actually is italicized here. But other than that, it's correct. And so even though there's some minor corrections that have to be made, it's still a big time saver to be able to just copy and paste this into your reference list versus typing it in on your own. All right, now let's back up a little bit. So remember that vector list, we have the 7 options. Let's say that you wanted to be looking at, let's go with developing purpose here. Let's try putting in the author's name, vector, and purpose, and see what comes up here. I'm betting we're going to get a lot more results than when we searched earlier. Yep, more than 1,200 results. Now these are about all sorts of things, so you probably want to get more specific. We're going to go ahead and we're going to click full text. Because I don't want to spend any extra time on things that I can't read or can't read easily. And you know what? You might be looking at one of these and saying, that's exactly what I'm interested in. Let's say this one here. They did a longitudinal study, meaning looking at things over time, usually a period of multiple years. And they're looking at gender differences. I'm interested. So I'll go ahead and click through to this source. And I see, okay, 247 students, mid-sized public university in the Southeast, that'll be Southeast United States. Looks good, and they're talking about how the results contradicted that assumption. So how might this come into play? Well, if I had read Chickering and Reiser's theory of development and about the specific vector about developing purpose and said, well, that doesn't match up with my experience at all. When I'm writing about that, I can align my experience with the literature and by referring to this other source. Chickering and Reiser stated blah. However, my own experience was different. Here's what happened. This aligned with, and in this case, if we're citing this source, it would be with Fubert et al.'s 2005 study that found that these things were different. So whatever it is, whether you're supporting your experience or talking about how it's divergent, you can reinforce your argument by making references to the literature. All right, that's all the time we have for today. So let's wrap up with a quick recap of this assignment. So remember, this assignment is asking that you be writing for a audience that is not necessarily familiar with with Reiser and this idea. So you're going to introduce them to the vector that you're discussing. Going to just to tell them in the outline portion of your paper at the beginning that you're going to be describing your own experience and how you've developed in this specific vector, and then how it does or doesn't align. And along the way, you'll be making references to the course text, as well as to any other sources that you choose to include. Any source that you directly read and cite, with primary citations, should be in your reference list. If it's a secondary citation that does not belong in the reference list, because the AP manual says not to do that. With that, I think we're going to bring this to a close. So thank you for joining us for another webinar. And you can find recordings of all our webinars and sign up for appointments and many other things through the ACU Online Writing Center website. Have a great day.